Up on the Bitterroot Divide, the wind doesn't just howl, it screams like a dying horse. Cole knew that terrible sound well, just as he knew the smell of wet pine freezing mud and his own stale sweat. What he didn't know was the scent of a gunshot wound on a timber wolf, at least not until he tracked its blood trail up a sheer granite ridge. He had climbed up there to end a miserable creature's suffering, but what waited for him in the dark gutted him completely. The snow crust broke under Cole's boots with a sound like snapping bones. It was mid-November, but the Wyoming winter had already locked its jaw around the valley. The air was so cold it burned the back of his throat with every intake tasting of metallic frost and dead leaves. Cole paused, leaning heavily on his Springfield rifle. He was 38, but his knees felt 60. 10 years of trapping skinning, and sleeping on frozen dirt had weathered him into something that resembled the mountains themselves, hard, quiet, and mostly worn down. He spat into the snow. It froze before it hit the ground. His trap line had been empty for 3 days. Nothing but a few frozen squirrels and a marten that had been torn to shreds by a scavenger. His stomach gave a hollow, scraping ache. He needed meat. He needed pelts. He didn't need a mystery. But there it was, smeared across the pristine white powder, like crushed cranberries. Blood. Cole knelt. The wind bit through his canvas coat, finding the gaps where the wool lining had worn thin. He took off his right glove, exposing skin that was permanently stained with soot and tannin. He touched the blood. Frozen solid, but the edges were still a vibrant red. Recent. Less than an hour. Beside the blood were tracks. Wolf. Big one. Cole stood up, his joints popping in the silence. A wolf was competition, but a dead wolf was a bounty and a heavy pelt. He checked the action on his Springfield. A single heavy metallic clack echoed into the pines. He began to walk. The trail didn't make sense. The tracks were uneven, dragging on the right hind side. A trap wouldn't leave a trail like this. A trap held you until you starved or chewed your own leg off. This was a glancing blow, a bullet. But Cole hadn't heard a rifle crack all week, and he was 50 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, a muddy logging camp called Stormhaven. No one came up this high in November, unless they were lost or running. He followed the crimson drops for 2 miles. The terrain shifted from dense lodgepole pine to jagged, exposed granite. The incline steepened. Cole's breath came in ragged white plumes. Sweat prickled under his collar, chilling instantly against his skin. He hated the climb. He hated the burning in his thighs. But the trail was fresh, and stubbornness was the only thing Cole had in abundance. He found the animal resting beneath an overhang of shale. It was a male timber wolf, massive and grey, blending almost perfectly with the rock. Its head was down, resting on its front paws. Blood matted the fur along its ribs, a dark, sticky mess where a bullet had grazed the flesh and torn the muscle. Cole raised the rifle. The stock felt cold against his cheek. He aligned the iron sights with the back of the wolf's skull. A clean shot. No suffering. A quick end to a brutal existence. His finger hovered over the trigger. The wolf lifted its head. It didn't bare its teeth. It didn't growl. It just looked at him. The eyes were a pale, startling amber, glassy with pain and fatigue. Cole held the rifle steady. He waited for the instinct to fire the familiar cold detachment that allowed him to survive. It didn't come. The wolf blinked slowly, then forced itself up. Its hind legs shook. It let out a low, rattling breath, turned its back on Cole, and began to limp higher up the rock face. "Stupid bastard!" Cole muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He lowered the rifle. He should have shot it. It was going to die anyway, freezing to death or bleeding out in some crevice. But something about the deliberate way the animal had looked at him, then turned its back. A complete dismissal of the danger Cole presented irritated him. He followed. He told himself it was to ensure he didn't lose the pelt in a deep ravine. He told himself he was just being thorough. He didn't tell himself the truth, that the overwhelming silence of the mountains had started to drive him mad, and following a dying wolf gave him something to focus on besides his own empty cabin. The climb became brutal. The rock was slick with rime ice. Cole slipped twice, tearing the skin off his knuckles against the sharp granite. The blood from his hand mixed with the wolf's trail. The wind up here was a physical force shoving against his chest, trying to push him back down into the valley. Ahead, the wolf disappeared behind a massive boulder that leaned against the cliff face. Cole scrambled up the last few yards, his lungs burning his heart, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He rounded the boulder rifle raised, expecting to find the animal dead in a snowbank. Instead, he found a hole in the mountain. It was a narrow fissure, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, hidden perfectly by the angle of the stone. The wolf's tracks led straight inside. Cole stepped closer. The wind died down, immediately blocked by the rock. He stood at the threshold of the cave, peering into the pitch black. Then he smelled it. It wasn't just the wet, musky stench of the wolf. It was something sharper, the bitter tang of sulfur, the stale, choking odor of wet ash, and beneath that, something deeply, unsettlingly human. Sickness, sweat, fear. Cole tightened his grip on the rifle. He didn't want to go in. Every survival instinct he had, honed over a decade, screamed at him to turn around, hike back to his cabin, and lock the heavy wooden door. Nothing good hid in caves, but the snow was beginning to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that would soon bury the trail back down. He needed shelter, even if just for an hour. He took a breath that tasted like stone and stepped into the dark. The darkness swallowed him whole. Cole stood perfectly still just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust. The air in the cave was dead and heavy, 10 degrees warmer than outside, but damp enough to chill the marrow. The silence was absolute, save for his own ragged breathing and the faint, rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep in the cavern. Slowly shapes began to pull themselves from the black. The walls were rough, slick with moisture. The floor was uneven, littered with loose shale. About 20 feet in the tunnel widened into a small chamber. A faint grey light filtered down from a narrow crack in the ceiling, high above, illuminating the center of the room. In that pool of dim light, the wolf lay curled in a tight ball. Its breathing was shallow and fast. It didn't look at Cole this time. It looked exhausted, defeated. Cole stepped forward, his boots scraping loudly against the stone. Click. The sound was tiny, sharp, and unmistakably mechanical. It echoed off the damp walls, freezing Cole mid-stride. He knew that sound intimately. It was the hammer of a revolver being pulled back. "Don't take another step." The voice was a dry rasp, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried a desperate, brittle edge. It came from the darkest corner of the chamber, a pile of shadows, just beyond the reach of the faint light. Cole didn't raise his hands, but he didn't raise his rifle either. He kept it angled downward, his body tense, calculating the distance to the voice. "I'm not moving," Cole said. His own voice sounded strangely loud in the enclosed space. "You got a steady hand on that peace, friend." A pause. Then a ragged cough that sounded wet and painful. "Steady enough to put a hole through your chest." It was a woman. Cole's brow furrowed. The irritation flared up again, hot and heavy in his gut. A woman. Out here, in November. It was absurd. It was impossible. Yet the metallic click of the gun was very real. "You're shaking," Cole said flatly. I can hear the cylinder rattling against the frame. You pull that trigger, you might hit me. But I guarantee my rifle goes off, and it's pointing right where you're sitting. Leave. Can't do that, Cole said, shifting his weight slightly. The cold from the stone floor was seeping through his boots. There's a blizzard blowing in. I step back out there, right now. I'm blind in 10 minutes, and frozen in an hour. Not my problem. Making it my problem, though. Cole let out a slow breath. He reached into his coat pocket with his left hand. Stop! The panic in her voice spiked. Just getting a match, lady. Cole said, his tone deliberately bored. He pulled out a wooden matchstick, struck it against the rough stone wall, and brought it up. The sulphur flared, casting harsh, jumping shadows across the cave. She was huddled against the back wall, wrapped in a filthy, moth-eaten wool blanket. Her hair was a tangled mess of dark brown, plastered to her forehead, with sweat despite the cold. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with dark, bruised hollows under her eyes. She held a rusted Colt peacemaker, with both hands pointing it squarely at Cole's center mass. She looked terrifyingly young and terrifyingly close to death. To her left, the remains of a fire sat in a ring of blackened stones. It had been dead for days. The match burned down to Cole's fingers. He didn't drop it until the flame licked his calloused skin. The cave plunged back into the grey gloom. "You look like hell," Cole said. "Get out." Her arms were trembling so violently now that the gun dipped. Cole sighed. He slung his rifle over his shoulder. The sudden movement made her flinch, but she didn't fire. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, keeping his movements loose and non-threatening. He stopped near the dead fire pit, about 10 feet from her. "Put the gun down," Cole said, "before you drop it and blow your own foot off." "Who are you?" she demanded, ignoring his order. "Did they send you?" "Nobody sent me," Cole said. "I'm a trapper. I live down in the valley. I followed that miserable creature." He nodded toward the wolf. "He's bleeding out. Thought I'd take his pelt." The woman looked at the wolf, then back to Cole. For a second, the hard mask of defiance slipped, revealing a profound, crippling exhaustion. "Don't hurt him," she whispered. Cole stared at her. "He's a wolf, miss. He'd eat you if he had the energy." "He guided me here. He stayed." Cole rubbed his jaw, the heavy stubble making a scratching sound. This was a mess. A massive, tangled mess that he had no desire to be part of. He looked at the dead fire, then at the woman shivering under the thin blanket. "You're burning up with fever," he stated a matter of fact. "And you're freezing to death at the same time. You got any wood?" "No." Cole unslung his pack and dropped it heavily onto the dirt floor. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't try to soothe her. He operated purely on the mechanics of survival. "Keep the gun pointed at me if it makes you feel better," he grunted, unbuckling the leather straps of his canvas bag. "But I'm starting a fire. If you shoot me, you'll have a dead man stinking up your cave and you'll still freeze tonight." He didn't look at her to see her reaction. He pulled out a small hatchet and a few chunks of dry fatwood he always carried for emergencies. He went to work. His movements were precise, economic. He gathered the old unburnt twigs from her dead fire, shaved the fatwood into thin ribbons, and arranged them perfectly. He struck another match. The shavings caught immediately, a bright, eager orange flame that pushed back the damp dark. He fed it larger sticks, building the heat. The smell of wood smoke filled the cave, cutting through the stench of sickness. Only then did he look up. She had lowered the gun. It rested in her lap, her hands still clutching the grip, but her head had fallen back against the stone wall. Her eyes were closed. The firelight flickered over her face, highlighting the sharp angles of starvation. Cole sat back on his heels, feeling the heat on his cold face. He looked at the dying wolf, then at the dying woman. Damn it, he whispered into the smoke. The fire snapped a sharp popping sound that echoed off the damp ceiling. Cole fed it a thick branch of dead pine he'd hauled in from the cave entrance. He worked methodically, stoking the heat until it pushed the biting cold back against the rock walls. The woman hadn't moved in an hour. Her breathing was a ragged, shallow rattle in her chest. Cole sat on an overturned crate he'd found half buried in the dirt, likely left by miners decades ago. He pulled a battered tin cup from his pack, filled it with snow from the entrance, and set it near the coals to melt. He was annoyed. His muscles ached, his stomach was hollow, and he was currently wasting his emergency fatwood and precious time on a stranger who had threatened to shoot him. He looked over at her. Her blanket had slipped, revealing a soiled cotton dress that offered no protection against the winter. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin pulled tight over her cheekbones. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked over to her. He didn't tread lightly. "Hey," he grunted, nudging her boot with his own. She didn't stir. Cole cursed quietly. He knelt beside her, the smell of fever sweat and stale dirt hitting him hard. He didn't want to touch her. Involvement meant responsibility, and responsibility out here usually meant somebody got killed. But he couldn't just watch her die. Not while he sat by a warm fire. He reached out his thick, calloused fingers, brushing against her forehead. It was burning, radiating a dry, unnatural heat. "Wake up!" he said louder this time, grabbing her shoulder and giving it a firm shake. Her eyes snapped open. Panic flared in the dark irises. She thrashed backward, her hand scrambling for the heavy Colt revolver that had slipped into the dirt. Cole's hand shot out, clamping down on her wrist before she could reach the grip. His grip was iron-hard, built from years of wrestling traps and skinning hides. "Settle down," he snapped, his voice sharp and lacking any bedside manner. "I'm not hurting you. Let go of the damn gun." She fought him, her breathing hitching in terror. But she was weak. Her struggles were pathetic, like a bird fluttering against a window pane. After a few seconds, she collapsed back against the stone, her chest heaving. She glared at him with pure, venomous hatred. "You're sick," Cole said, releasing her wrist. He picked up the revolver, popped the cylinder, and dumped the heavy lead cartridges into his palm. He tossed the empty gun back onto her blanket. "And now you're unarmed, so stop trying to kill the only person keeping you from freezing." She stared at the empty gun, then back at him. "I didn't ask for your help, and I didn't ask to find you." Cole shot back, standing up and walking back to the fire. The water in the tin cup was boiling. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat, pinched out a measure of dried willow bark and yarrow, and dropped it into the water. The smell was bitter, earthy. "What is that?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Something to break the fever, or kill you faster. At this point, it's a coin toss." Cole didn't smile. He wasn't trying to be funny. He stirred the brew with a twig. The wolf, still curled in the shadows, let out a low whine. Cole glanced at the animal. The bleeding had stopped, frozen over by the cold air of the cave, but the beast looked terrible. Its coat was dull, its breathing labored. "He needs water," the woman said. Cole scoffed. "He's a wild animal. He needs a bullet. If you shoot him, I'll find a way to kill you," she said. The threat lacked physical weight, but the absolute certainty in her tone made Cole pause. He poured half the hot, bitter tea into a secondary tin bowl. He grabbed the cup and walked back over to her. He crouched, holding the rim near her mouth. "Drink it. It tastes like mud, but it'll make you sweat." She hesitated, looking at his filthy hands, then at the dark liquid. Thirst won over pride. She reached up with trembling hands to take the cup, but her fingers couldn't grip the metal. It slipped. Cole caught it before it spilled. "Just lean forward," he grunted, frustrated by the intimacy of the act. He brought the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, coughing as the hot liquid hit her raw throat. Some of it spilled down her chin. Cole didn't wipe it away. He just pulled the cup back when she started to choke. "Slow down," he muttered. When she finished, she sank back into the wall, her eyes closing. "My name is Joe," she whispered. "Didn't ask," Cole said. He walked back to the fire. He took the secondary bowl, filled it with warm snowmelt, and walked over to the wolf. The animal watched him approach, its amber eyes tracking his every movement. Cole didn't get too close. He slid the bowl across the dirt until it bumped against the wolf's paw. The wolf sniffed it, then slowly, painfully extended its tongue and began to lap the water. Cole watched it for a moment, the tension in his shoulders refusing to unknot. He had a dying woman and a crippled predator to look after. His trapping season was ruined. His supplies wouldn't last a week, shared between two people. He sat back down on the crate and pulled a piece of hardtack from his bag. It was stale and tasted of sawdust, but he chewed it methodically, staring into the flames. The wind outside began to howl a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the stone. The blizzard had arrived. The cave entrance was already clogging with snow, turning the grey light to pitch black. They were sealed in. Cole looked at Joe. She was shivering again, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear it over the fire. The tea wasn't working fast enough. He cursed again, a long, low string of profanities, aimed at the mountain, the snow, and his own stupid conscience. He stood up, grabbed his heavy, fur-lined buffalo hide coat, and walked over to her. He dropped the heavy coat over her shivering form, burying her in the thick fur. "Don't get used to it," he said to the darkness. He walked back to the fire, sitting on the crate, in nothing but his canvas jacket and wool shirt. The chill of the cave immediately began to gnaw at his bones. He crossed his arms, staring into the flames, calculating how many days of wood he could scavenge from the cave floor before he had to freeze to death outside. Across the cave, Joe clutched the heavy fur coat around her. It smelled of pine pitch old blood and a deep masculine musk. It was the warmest thing she had felt in weeks. She opened her eyes, watching the broad-shouldered man sitting hunched over the fire. He wasn't a savior. He was rough, mean, and smelled like a wet dog. But he hadn't shot her, and he hadn't left her. For the first time since she started running, Joe closed her eyes and actually slept. The storm didn't just bury the cave, it erased the world outside. The howling wind dropped an octave, vibrating through the limestone walls like a massive, dying heartbeat. Snow packed the narrow entrance, solid, turning the grey twilight into a suffocating, pitch-black tomb. Cole kept the fire small. He had to. Smoke hung in the upper half of the cavern, a sharp, eye-watering haze that tasted of ash and claustrophobia. Cole sat on the dirt, his knees pulled up to his chest, shivering in his thin canvas jacket. He fed the flames one broken twig at a time. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against his spine, sinking into the marrow of his legs. Beside him, Joe began to thrash. The willow bark tea hadn't broken the fever. It had only stoked the furnace. She kicked out her heavy boots, scraping against the loose shale. A low, ragged moan tore from her throat, followed by a string of frantic, whispered words Cole couldn't understand. "Get off!" she gasped, her hands clawing at the buffalo hide coat. "Caleb. No. Get off." She shoved the heavy fur aside, exposing her soaked, shivering body to the freezing air. Cole cursed a sharp, ugly sound in the quiet. He scrambled over to her on his hands and knees. He grabbed the heavy coat and threw it back over her, but she fought him. Her eyes were wide open, staring blindly at the cavern roof, locked in whatever nightmare was playing out behind them. Her fingernails caught Cole's wrist, digging in deep enough to draw blood. "Hold still, damn it!" He growled, pinning her shoulders down with his forearms. She possessed the terrifying, frantic strength of the dying. She writhed her head, snapping side to side. "I'll shoot, I swear to God, Caleb." "There's no Caleb here." Cole said, his face inches from hers. He smelled the sour tang of old sweat fear and the metallic odor of her bleeding lips. "It's just me, the trapper. You're in a cave." She didn't hear him. She bucked her hips, trying to dislodge an invisible weight. Cole shifted his grip, trapping her arms under the heavy coat and pressing his considerable weight down on her chest. It felt wrong. It felt violent. He hated the mechanics of it, hated the panic in her eyes. But if she kicked the blanket off again, the ambient cold would stop her heart before morning. "Stop fighting," he ordered, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly baritone. He didn't try to soothe her. He commanded her. "You're burning up your energy. Stop." Slowly the struggle drained out of her. Her body went limp beneath him, though her chest continued to heave with shallow, rapid breaths. Her eyes fluttered closed. Cole stayed there for a long minute, his chest pressed to hers through the layers of fur and canvas, feeling the frantic, bird-like flutter of her heart. When he was sure she was out, he rolled off her, his breath pluming white in the cold air. He crawled over to the cave entrance and dug a handful of packed snow from the blockage. He grabbed a filthy bandana from his back pocket, dumped the snow into it, and walked back. He knelt beside her, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pressing the icy cloth against her burning forehead. She flinched but didn't wake. Cole sat back on his heels. He looked across the fire. The wolf was watching him. Its head was resting on its paws, but those pale amber eyes tracked Cole's every twitch. It didn't growl, but the tension in its massive shoulders was obvious. "Don't look at me like that," Cole muttered to the animal. "I'm keeping her alive." The wolf blinked once, slowly. Cole rubbed his face with his soot-stained hands. His stomach cramped a sharp, hollow ache. He reached into his pack, his fingers brushing past his traps and skinning knives until he found his last block of salt pork. It was hard as a brick and coated in greasy lint. He sliced off a thin ribbon with his hunting knife and chewed it raw, the salt burning his tongue. It wasn't enough, but it would keep him upright. He spent the rest of the night locked in a grim rotation, feeding the fire, pressing snow to Joe's forehead, and staring into the dark, waiting for the mountain to crush them. Silence woke him. The constant vibrating hum of the wind had stopped. Cole lay on the hard dirt, his body stiff, his muscles screaming in protest as he shifted. The fire had died down to a bed of pulsing red embers. The air in the cave was stale, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the rotting, sickly sweet odor of the wolf's wound. He pushed himself up. The cave entrance was still a solid wall of white. He walked over to Joe. She was asleep, but her breathing was deeper, more rhythmic. The angry flush had left her cheeks replaced by a pallid, chalky white. The fever had broken. She looked half dead, completely drained of whatever fire had kept her going. Cole didn't wake her. He took his hatchet and walked to the entrance. It took him 2 hours to break through. He hacked at the packed snow, his breath tearing in his throat, sweat soaking his shirt despite the freezing temperature. His shoulders burned. Every swing sent a jolt of pain up his forearms. When the hatchet finally broke through the outer crust, blinding white light flooded the cavern so sharp and intense it felt like a physical blow. Cole stumbled back, throwing an arm over his eyes. Fresh, freezing air rushed in, sweeping away the stagnant stench of the cave. He stood at the opening, blinking until his vision cleared. The world outside was buried. 3 feet of fresh powder covered the granite ridges. The pine trees below were bent double under the weight of the snow. The sky was a hard, cloudless blue. Beautiful and completely lethal. Traveling in this without snowshoes would be suicide. "Are we buried?" The voice was weak, dry as dust. Cole turned. Joe was sitting up, leaning heavily against the cave wall. The buffalo coat was pooled around her waist. She looked small. "We're open," Cole said, walking back toward the fire pit. He tossed a few more sticks onto the embers and blew on them until they caught. "But we ain't going anywhere. Snow's waist deep out there." Joe stared at the fire, her dark eyes hollow. "How long was I out?" 2 days and 2 nights. Cole grabbed his tin cup, filled it with fresh snow from the entrance, and set it to melt. "You fought me like a cornered bobcat the first night, almost kicked the fire out." Joe looked down at her hands. The fingernails were caked with dirt. I remember hands, pushing me down." "That was me," Cole said flatly, "keeping you from freezing to death. You owe me a new bandana, by the way. Used it to cool your head." She looked at him. Really looked at him. The hostility was still there, a hard kernel of mistrust, but the sheer exhaustion had stripped away the bravado. "Thank you," she whispered. The words sounded like they cost her dearly. Cole grunted. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small canvas sack. He poured a handful of dried pinto beans into the boiling water, then tossed in another sliver of salt pork. "It ain't a hotel breakfast," he said. "But it's hot." They waited in silence as the beans boiled. The only sound was the crackle of the wood and the heavy breathing of the wolf. The animal had dragged itself closer to the heat while Cole was digging. It lay a few feet from Joe, its nose resting near her boot. "He smells terrible," Cole said, nodding at the wolf. Joe reached down. Her hand trembled slightly as she rested it on the thick grey ruff of the wolf's neck. The animal let out a low rumble, not a growl, but a sound of contentment. "He's rotting," Cole said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Bullet took a chunk of muscle out of his flank. Dirt got in. If the infection hits his blood, he's done." "Can you fix it?" Joe asked, looking up. "I'm a trapper, miss. I take pelts off animals. I don't sew them back on. You kept me alive. You're a human being." "Barely. He's a walking payday." Cole stirred the beans with his knife. "Besides, I get close enough to dig around in his flank. He'll take my arm off." "He won't." Joe stroked the animal's fur. "He knows." Cole scoffed, pouring half the watery bean mixture into a tin plate and sliding it across the dirt toward her. "He don't know anything. He's hungry and he's hurting. That makes him dangerous." He ate his own portion directly from the cup, chewing the hard beans mechanically. He was still hungry when he finished. He looked at the wolf, then at the rifle leaning against the wall, then back at the woman. "Eat," he commanded, "because when I hold him down, you're going to have to keep his jaws shut." The stench was worse up close. It was the heavy, sweet reek of gangrene, thick enough to coat the back of Cole's throat. He knelt beside the wolf, a strip of clean leather in his teeth and his skinning knife in his right hand. Beside him lay a tin cup of water he'd brought to a rolling boil, and a small glass flask of clear grain alcohol he kept for starting fires in wet conditions. Joe knelt at the wolf's head. She looked terrified, her knuckles white as she gripped the thick fur behind the animal's ears. "If he snaps, you throw your weight onto his neck and roll away," Cole instructed, his voice low and tight. "Do not pull your hands back or he'll catch your fingers. Understand?" Joe nodded once. "All right. Hold him." Cole moved quickly. He pressed his left forearm hard across the wolf's ribcage, pinning the animal to the dirt. With his right hand, he took the boiling water and poured it directly over the matted, blood-crusted wound on the flank. The wolf exploded. A guttural, deafening roar tore from the animal's chest. It bucked violently, throwing its massive weight against Cole's arm. Jo slammed her body weight over the wolf's neck, crying out as the thick muscles writhed beneath her. The animal snapped its jaws teeth, clacking loudly inches from her face. "Hold him!" Cole shouted over the snarling. He didn't hesitate. He took the skinning knife, its edge honed to a razor finish, and cut away the blackened necrotic flesh around the bullet track. Blood dark and thick with pus welled up instantly. The wolf screamed a high, unnatural sound that made the hair on Cole's arms stand up. Cole tossed the rotting meat aside. He grabbed the flask with his teeth, uncorked it, and dumped the raw alcohol directly into the open, bleeding crater. The wolf spasmed so hard, it threw Cole backward onto the shale. Jo lost her grip and scrambled away, pressing herself flat against the cavern wall. The wolf scrambled to its feet, its hind leg completely useless. It spun around, snapping wildly at its own flank, snarling flecks of bloody foam flying from its jaws. It glared at Cole, its teeth-bared ears pinned back flat. Cole didn't reach for his gun. He stayed perfectly still on the ground, making himself small, keeping his eyes averted from a direct stare. He waited. For 10 agonizing seconds, the cavern echoed with the animal's ragged, furious breathing. Then the adrenaline broke. The wolf collapsed, sliding down the cave wall in a heap of grey fur, panting heavily. The wound was raw, bleeding, fresh, bright red blood, but the black rot was gone. Cole let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a filthy hand. "Christ," he muttered. Jo was shaking violently against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Is it done?" "Yeah." Cole picked up his knife, wiping the blood off on his canvas trousers. "Now we just see if the shock kills him." He walked back to the fire pit and sat heavily on his crate. His hands were shaking slightly. He clamped them together between his knees. Jo slowly crawled away from the wall, giving the exhausted wolf a wide berth, and sat on the dirt across the fire from him. She pulled the buffalo coat tight around her shoulders. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the wood. The violent burst of action had stripped away the remaining barriers between them. The cave felt smaller now. "Stormhaven," Jo said quietly, her voice staring into the flames. Cole looked up. "You said you trade in Stormhaven." She paused, swallowing hard. "I shot a man there 3 days ago." Cole didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He just reached out, picked up a stick, and prodded the fire. Thought as much. The gun. The running. Didn't figure you for a recreational hiker. He was a deputy. Jo continued the words, spilling out quickly now as if she needed to vomit them up. "His name was Caleb. He owned the boarding house where I worked, and he thought he owned me." She looked up at Cole, her eyes shining with unshed tears and fierce defiance. "I told him no. I told him a dozen times. He cornered me in the washroom. He hit me, knocked me to the floor." She touched the faded yellowish bruise along her jawline. "He dropped his gun belt when he bent over. I grabbed it. I didn't even think. I just cocked it and pulled the trigger." Cole listened, his face, an impassive mask of dirt and stubble. "Where'd you hit him?" "Stomach." Jo shuddered. He fell screaming. "I took the gun, grabbed a horse, and rode out. The horse threw a shoe on the ridge and bolted. I walked the rest of the way, found the cave. Then the wolf showed up." "Belly wound," Cole grunted. "Takes a long time to die from a belly wound. If he's a deputy, they got a doctor in Stormhaven. He might have made it. If he made it, he'll send a posse. If he died, they'll send a posse," Cole corrected her. He rubbed his eyes. "You don't shoot the law in Wyoming, miss. Doesn't matter what he tried to do to you. A badge is a badge. They'll hang you from the logging crane in the center of camp." "I know." Her voice cracked. "That's why I came up here, to freeze." Cole looked at her. He saw the sharp jut of her collarbones, the bruised skin, the sheer, desperate terror wrapped in a thin veneer of grit. He hated it. He hated the way it pulled at the rusty, long-forgotten machinery of his conscience. He came to the mountains to avoid people, to avoid the messy, brutal entanglements of human cruelty. And now it was sitting by his fire. "They won't come up the ridge," Cole said slowly, weighing his words. "Not in this snow. They'll wait for the thaw. Trackers'll find the dead horse. Then they'll find this cave." "So I leave," Jo said, her jaw tightening. "When the storm passes, I'll walk out. I won't bring them down on you." "Don't be stupid." Cole snapped, the irritation returning. "You'll make it half a mile before you freeze solid or break an ankle in a snowdrift." He stood up, grabbing his rifle to check the action, purely out of nervous habit. "So what do I do?" she demanded, anger flashing. "Sit here and let them hang me?" "No," Cole said, looking out of the open cave entrance at the glaring white expanse. "We sit here and let the wolf heal. Let you get some meat on your bones. And when the snow crusts over hard enough to hold weight..." He turned back to look at her. "We walk over the divide, into Idaho." Jo stared at him, stunned. "Why would you do that?" Cole didn't have a good answer. He didn't want to explain that watching her fight the fever reminded him of things he'd tried to bury. He didn't want to admit that the silence of his cabin suddenly seemed worse than a posse. "Because," Cole muttered, tossing a piece of wood onto the fire, "I've already wasted my good fatwood on you. Be ashamed to let them hang you now. Time in the cave lost its shape. It stopped being measured in hours or days, degrading into a blurred, exhausting cycle of gathering deadwood and boiling snow. The sharp, sweet stench of the wolf's rotting flank slowly faded, replaced by the heavy, musky odor of wet fur and drying scabs. For 2 days the animal lay completely motionless, a grey mound of ragged breathing against the limestone. On the 3rd morning, he dragged himself by his front paws towards the water tin. By the 5th, he was hobbling to the cave entrance on 3 legs to eat the snow directly. They called him Scrap. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a factual observation of what he was made of. The proximity within the cave became suffocating. Cole was a man built for the vast, echoing silence of the high timber. He tolerated the biting wind and the empty horizons because they asked nothing of him. Now he was trapped in a stone box 10 feet across, sharing his breathing air with a stranger. It made his skin crawl with a nervous, electric energy. He noticed things he desperately wanted to ignore. He noticed the way Jo's hair finally stripped of the fever sweat, caught the dull orange firelight in dark copper flashes. He noticed the purple and yellow fading of the bruise along her jawline. He noticed the sheer, stubborn set of her shoulders when she stared into the flames. He hated how hyper-aware of her he was. When the silence grew too heavy, Cole would strip down the bolt of his Springfield rifle, the metallic clack-snick of the oiled steel acting as a barrier between them. He covered his unease with a harsh, unyielding gruffness. He barked orders about firewood. He criticized how she fed the embers. He did everything he could to keep the space between them wide and hostile. He spent the daylight hours outside, hunting the immediate vicinity just to escape her. He wove makeshift snowshoes from green pine boughs and stiff rawhide, strapping them over his boots to stay atop the 4-foot drifts. The cold out there was an absolute physical violence. It froze the moisture in his nostrils instantly. He checked the wire snares he'd set along a buried rabbit run. Mostly he found nothing. Today he found a single stiff snowshoe hair, frozen solid in the wire loop, its eyes glazed white. It weighed less than 3 pounds, barely enough calories to replace the energy he burned walking out here. He unhooked the frozen carcass, his fingers numbing through his heavy leather gloves. He paused, staring at the vast, empty expanse of the Wyoming wilderness. A week ago, he would have eaten the hare raw on the trail and slept under a snowbank. Now, he turned back toward the dark maw of the cave. He was providing. The realization settled in his gut like a swallowed stone. He ducked back inside, throwing the stiff hare onto the dirt near the fire. "Skin it!" he grunted, unbuttoning his stiff canvas coat and shaking off the powder. Jo didn't flinch at his tone. She had stopped flinching around him entirely. She picked up the hare, drawing a small, sharp knife Cole had lent her. She worked methodically, stripping the pelt, ignoring the blood that stained her cracked fingernails. An hour later, she sat holding a sharpened pine stick over the coals, the lean meat sizzling and popping in the heat. "You're burning it," Cole said from his crate, his boots off his thick wool socks, steaming in the ambient cold. "It's not burning, it's searing," Jo replied, not taking her eyes off the fire. "If you want it raw, you can bite it off the carcass next time." "Meat out here ain't about taste, it's about fuel," Cole shot back. "You burn the fat off you're burning, what keeps your heart beating." "I'll remember that when I'm eating charcoal," she muttered, rotating the spit. Cole scrubbed a rough hand over his face. His beard was growing in thick and itchy. "Crust is hardening," he said, abruptly, shifting the conversation to the reality looming over them. "Another day of this deep freeze, the snow will pack tight enough to hold our weight without the boughs. We leave tomorrow night." Jo finally looked at him. The firelight cast sharp, flickering shadows across the hollows of her cheeks. "Night. We're going to climb the divide, in the dark. A full moon on a fresh snowpack is brighter than a cloudy noon," Cole said flatly. He didn't look at her. He looked at his rifle leaning against the rock. "If the deputies from Stormhaven pushed through the valley, they'll be looking for smoke, or tracks during the day. We move when they sleep." Jo nodded slowly. She looked at Scrap resting near the toes of her boots. "What about him? He keeps up or he freezes." Cole's voice brokered no argument. "I'm not carrying him." Jo didn't argue. She knew the rules of the altitude. She pulled the rabbit from the fire and laid it on the tin plate to cool. Tearing off a hind leg, she was careful to keep the greasy, sizzling fat intact. She extended it toward Cole. He reached out. Their fingers brushed. Cole pulled his hand back a fraction of a second too late. Her skin was rough, heavily calloused and stained with soot, but it was incredibly warm. A sudden tight coil of tension snapped in his chest. He looked up, catching her eyes. They were dark guarded, but holding his gaze with a steady, unblinking intensity that made the cave feel even smaller. He took the meat. He didn't say thank you. He just chewed the tough, bitter flesh in silence, staring into the dark corner of the cavern, deeply disturbed by the terrifying realization that he didn't want to leave her behind. The air at midnight didn't just bite, it paralyzed. It was a physical weight that pressed against Cole's chest the moment he kicked his way out of the cave entrance. He sucked in a breath, and the air tasted of metallic frost, freezing the moisture in his nostrils instantly. The silence was absolute, a heavy dead thing that made the crunch of his boots sound like gunshots. The world was stripped of color, painted in the stark, blinding blue-white of a full moon reflecting off a virgin snowpack. Cole moved with a deliberate mechanical rhythm. Step kick plant, step kick plant. His Springfield rifle bounced heavily against his spine with every movement. He didn't look back. Looking back wasted momentum. But he could hear her. Jo's breathing was a ragged, whistling scrape in the thin air echoing a few yards behind his heels, and behind her came the soft, uneven pad drag of Scrap, pulling his ruined hind leg through the powder. The wolf was running on borrowed time, and sheer, dumb instinct. 2 hours in the timberline vanished entirely. The shelter of the pines gave way to exposed granite scoured bare by centuries of wind. The incline steepened drastically, transforming from a brutal hike into a grueling vertical crawl. Sweat beaded on the back of Cole's neck, chilling into a slick layer of rime against his skin beneath the heavy canvas coat. His thighs burned with a dull lactic fire. To their left, the ridge fell away into a sheer, black abyss, a drop of 1,000 feet, where the shadows pooled like dark water. Cole drove the toe of his boot into the ice crust, testing it for stability, before shifting his full weight. The sound was tiny, but it stopped Cole's heart. A sharp scrape of leather slipping on rime ice, followed by a sudden violent intake of breath. Cole snapped his head around. Jo was 30 feet below him. Her boot had failed to break the crust. She went down hard, her knees slamming into the frozen granite. The slope offered no friction. She immediately began to slide backward, gaining speed, moving rapidly toward the black edge of the drop. She didn't scream. She just scrambled wildly, her gloved hands clawing at the slick ice, finding nothing to hold. Jobakus tor. Cole's voice tore out of his raw throat, entirely stripped of its usual gruff control. He abandoned his foothold. He threw his weight forward, sliding down the treacherous incline on his stomach, using his boots and elbows to break against the stone. He hit the flat shelf of rock, just as Jo's legs slipped over the edge. Cole lunged. His thick, calloused fingers dug into the heavy fur collar of her buffalo coat. He clamped down with an iron grip. The sudden weight of her dropping body wrenched his shoulder socket. Pain flared blindingly hot down his arm. He gritted his teeth, groaning as the tendons in his neck popped, and dug his boot cleats into a narrow, frozen fissure in the rock. "Pull!" he roared, hauling backward with everything he had left. For a terrible second, they didn't move. Then, inch by agonizing inch, he dragged her up over the lip of the abyss. They collapsed onto the flat granite shelf, a tangled heap of canvas fur and heavy, panicked breathing. Jo's face was buried against his collarbone. She was shaking violently, her fingers twisted into the fabric of his jacket with a death grip. Cole wrapped his arms around her back, pressing her tightly into his chest. He didn't pull away. For a long, terrifying minute, the cynical, isolated trapper disappeared entirely. He just held her, feeling the frantic, bird-like thud of her heart against his ribs. It was the closest he had been to another human being in a decade, and it scared him far more than the cliff edge had. "I've got you." Cole rasped his breath, pluming white over her dark hair. "I've got you." She pulled back slightly. Her eyes were wide, glassy with terror, but beneath it was a fierce, desperate gratitude. "I can't," she choked out her voice, barely a whisper against the wind. "My legs are dead." Cole's face hardened. He couldn't let her crack. "Not here." "You can," he said, his tone dropping back to a harsh, gravelly command. "You shot a deputy, remember? You're too mean to die on a rock." A wet, broken laugh escaped her lips. "You're a bastard. And you're breathing." Cole shoved himself to his feet. He uncoiled the heavy hemp rope slung over his pack. He tied a quick, tight bowline around his own waist, then knelt and secured the other end firmly around hers. "If you fall, you drag me down with you," he said, staring directly into her dark, exhausted eyes. "So don't fall." He turned and resumed the climb. The rope pulled taut between them, a literal lifeline binding them together in the crushing cold. An hour later, the steep incline rounded off. They crested the saddle of the divide. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a shrieking gale that threatened to push them back down into Wyoming. Cole braced his legs, hauling on the rope, until Jo stood beside him. They looked out over the spine of the world. Behind them was the long, deadly drop and the life she was running from. Ahead, the terrain sloped downward, into a vast, sprawling valley, choked with dense black Idaho timber. Scrap limped up beside them, panting heavily, his pale eyes surveying the descent. Joe swayed in the wind. Slowly she reached out. She didn't say a word, just slipped her rough, freezing fingers into Cole's hand. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, staring into the dark woods, and squeezed back. The sun broke over the jagged eastern peaks, not with warmth, but with a harsh, blinding glare that turned the unbroken snowfields into crushed glass. The descent into Idaho was a clumsy, stumbling fall. Here the terrain changed. The wind, a constant shrieking companion on the Wyoming side, died instantly as they sank into the ancient timberline. The trees were massive, suffocatingly dense, Douglas fir and red cedar that blocked out the pale sky. The air here didn't smell like sterile ice. It smelled alive. It smelled of heavy, sap-damp earth waiting beneath the drifts and the sharp metallic tang of the rushing water somewhere ahead. By noon, the temperature crept just above freezing. The top layer of powder turned to slush, clinging to their boots like wet concrete. Every step required a deliberate, agonizing heave of the thigh. Joe dragged her feet the heavy hemp rope slung between them, going slack and trailing through the mud and snow. Cole's shoulders burned. His knees popped with every downward step, a dry, grinding friction in his joints that echoed in his own ears. They found the creek an hour later. It was a fast, violent cut of black water, tearing through shelves of thick, blue ice. The sound of it was a low, steady roar that filled the clearing and drowned out the ringing in their heads. Cole stopped. He reached up his fingers, numb and clumsy, and unbuckled the leather straps of his canvas pack. He let it drop. It hit the slush with a heavy, final thud. He didn't immediately start clearing a fire pit. He didn't set up a perimeter wire. Instead, he unslung his hatchet, his thumb running over the nicked steel edge, and walked toward a massive cedar that had been brought down by a previous storm. Thwack! The sound was sharp, a violent punctuation mark in the quiet woods. Joe sank onto a flat, snow-cleared stone near the water's edge. The buffalo coat hung open, her chest heaving as she sucked in the heavy pine-scented air. She couldn't even summon the energy to shiver. She just watched him. Cole moved with a steady, relentless rhythm. Thwack! Snap! He wasn't dragging deadwood to snap over his knee for a quick, smokeless fire. He was driving the hatchet deep into green wood, limbing the thick branches, notching the heavy trunk. He was building a lean-to with load-bearing walls. He was building for a heavy winter. Cole paused, leaning on the handle of the hatchet. He wiped a mixture of sweat and sawdust from his forehead with the back of a filthy wrist. He looked at the dense, towering timber. He had spent his entire adult life running from the messy, brutal entanglements of people. He had retreated to the high altitudes where the air was thin enough to kill, and the rules were simple: eat, stay warm, survive. He had thought isolation was the only safety left in the world. Then he looked at Joe. Her face was a canvas of exhaustion. Hollow cheeks, cracked lips, bleeding slightly at the corners, dirt smeared across her brow. She was a fugitive with a bullet out for a deputy, carrying nothing but a stolen coat and a terrifying stubborn grit. She was the most complicated, dangerous anchor he could possibly tie himself to. Cole felt a heavy, terrifying settling in his gut. The frantic, hunted energy that had pushed them over the ridge was gone. He buried the hatchet into the stump. He walked over to the creek bank and sat heavily beside her. The smell of him was overwhelming: stale sweat, wood smoke, wet leather, and pine pitch. The silence between them wasn't heavy or hostile anymore. It was just an exhausted quiet. "I can't go back," Joe whispered. She stared blindly at the rushing black water, her hands trembling where they rested in her lap. "I'll never be able to go into a town again. I don't much like towns anyway. Cole grunted, staring at his boots. He reached into the deep, oilskin-lined pocket of his coat. He pulled out the heavy, rusted Colt Peacemaker he had unloaded and taken from her in the cave. He held it out by the barrel, the worn wooden grip facing her. Joe looked at the gun. She didn't reach for it. Her bruised jaw tightened. "I don't want it. Take it," Cole said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Out here you protect what's yours. You don't rely on the law and you don't rely on luck. You do it yourself." Slowly she extended her hand. Her dirty fingers wrapped around the checkered grip. The iron was freezing. "What's mine?" she asked, her voice cracking. Cole finally turned his head to meet her eyes. All the gruffness, all the cynical armor he wore to keep the world at bay, stripped away in the harsh, bright daylight. "This valley," he said. "This fire." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "Me, if you want." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a sweet, desperate declaration of romance. It was rough, awkward, and terribly honest. Joe stared at him. The corner of her cracked mouth twitched a tiny fractured smile breaking through the grime. She didn't offer a delicate kiss. She just leaned her weight to the side, closing the gap, and pressed her forehead hard against his shoulder. Her hands gripped the thick, stiff canvas of his coat. It was a grounding, a shared exhaustion, a mutual surrender to the survival they had bled for. Cole closed his eyes. He wrapped his thick, heavy arms around her, breathing in the scent of freezing wind and smoke that clung to her tangled hair. A sharp crack of breaking ice made them pull apart. They looked toward the water. Scrap stood on the rocky bank. The wolf was shivering, his ruined hind leg hovering above the snow, but his front paws were planted firmly on a massive, thrashing cutthroat trout. The fish slapped against the ice gills, flaring. Scrap looked up at them, blood from the fish's gills dripping down his grey muzzle. His pale amber eyes locked onto Cole.